A long-buried secret shook an old village to its core. Some things hidden beneath layers of time eventually demand to be uncovered, like a broken sugar bowl, bringing an ancient story back to life. But when the truth finally surfaces, everything changes: relationships, emotions, and even long-held beliefs. What if that hidden truth had never been revealed? Are you ready to uncover this mystery? It was a Tuesday morning, eerily luminous for early April, the kind of light that made ordinary things seem unreal, when Clara Redford, the live-in maid at the aging Langdon vicarage, finally committed the accident she had so often feared in her anxious imaginings. She broke something irreplaceable. As she balanced on the worn footstool to dust the seldom disturbed upper shelf of the vicar's grand old drawing-room cabinet, her elbow nudged the edge of a delicate bone china sugar jar, a pale ivory relic traced with cobalt vines, clearly a piece meant to be admired from a distance, not handled by servants. Time seemed to slow as the jar tipped, spun, and landed soundlessly on the thick Persian rug below. There was no crash, no dramatic shatter, just a crisp, unnatural split right down the middle, like something that had been waiting to break. Clara froze, breath caught mid-gasp, her mind already filling with images of Mrs. Everleigh's face, the vicar's icy wife, whose thin smile had the sharpness of fine silver, and who clung to her heirlooms not out of affection, but as emblems of lineage. Heart hammering, Clara knelt to retrieve the fractured porcelain, but as her fingers brushed the inside of one half, they met something foreign. A paper, yellowed but stiff, its folds too precise, too careful. There was a moment's pause, a flicker of dread, then she carefully pried it loose. The note was small, fragile, its ink faded to sepia, and as she read it, her skin prickled. The girl must never be told. If she uncovers the truth in the glass house, all is lost. The words danced before her eyes. The glass house, surely not the one at Thornhill, the very place locked and forgotten since Miss Evelyn Thorne's abrupt and quiet death 6 years ago. A scandal never spoken aloud, but never quite silenced either. Clara glanced at the broken jar again. Hadn't it been part of Miss Thorne's estate? She remembered the whispers, how a box of fine china had been delivered discreetly after the funeral, no one asking too many questions. Now, with the note quivering in her hand, Clara sensed this was no simple relic of domestic life. This was a message, buried on purpose, meant to be hidden, and found only by mischance. That evening, the secret gnawed at her resolve. She swore she'd keep quiet, but the weight of it pressed harder than any guilt she'd ever known. By Thursday, the dam cracked. While helping arrange hymnals at the parish hall, she leaned closer to Mrs. Havisham, the parish organist, with a flair for dramatics and a taste for anything vaguely scandalous, and hesitantly relayed her discovery, haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, the story unfolding as if she'd practiced it in her sleep. Mrs. Havisham's expression shifted from curiosity to something far keener, the gleam of a woman who'd waited years for something interesting to happen in a village where nothing ever did. "You must show this to Miss Elwood," she said firmly, rising half out of her chair. "If anyone can untangle such a thread, it's her." Reluctantly, Clara agreed. The next morning, she arrived at Miss Elwood's ivy-covered cottage on Lantern Street, the note folded once again, and pressed tightly between her gloved fingers. Miss Elwood, known for her quiet brilliance and unsettling intuition, took the paper with barely a word, her own fingers dusted with flour from a morning's bread-making. She read it slowly, her brow tightening by degrees, then placed it carefully in her lap. "A confession buried in a sugar jar," she murmured, "hidden not where secrets thrive, but where no one would ever think to look, unless fate intervened." Clara shifted uncomfortably, unsure if she was being blamed or thanked. Miss Elwood looked up, sharp now. Was Miss Thorne known to have any family? "None living," Clara said. "She lived alone, always did." Miss Elwood nodded absently, already piecing together something unseen. That evening, over untouched tea and fading daylight, she recounted the events to Mrs. Havisham. The room around them was hushed, the ticking of the mantel clock loud in the silence. Something was buried, Miss Elwood said softly, more to herself than to her companion, and someone, perhaps many someones, went to great lengths to keep it that way. Mrs. Havisham leaned forward, eyes wide. "I always thought Evelyn Thorne had ghosts," she whispered. "But maybe it wasn't ghosts. Maybe it was a truth too dangerous to leave above ground." The two women sat in silence, then the sugar jar, and its broken secret casting long shadows in their minds. It was the kind of grey brooding Thursday that seemed to hang motionless over the village of Eldergate, when Eleanor Briar arrived at the long-abandoned Wycliffe house, a place that hadn't seen its drapes drawn or its garden tended since the quiet, suspicious death of Beatrice Wycliffe, nearly a decade ago. No one knew much about Eleanor, except that her surname matched that of a once whispered companion of Beatrice's, a seamstress's daughter turned confidant, who vanished from the village records in 1937, without so much as a goodbye. Eleanor moved in without fanfare, unpacked after dusk, and requested groceries by handwritten notes left on the grocer's doorstep, signed only E. Her presence was so hushed, so spectral, it stirred not gossip but unease, and unease, in Eldergate, was rarer than scandal. Miss Tamsin Ellery, a retired schoolteacher with a knack for patterns, took notice first. She watched from her window as Eleanor walked each evening to the edge of Wycliffe's crumbling orchard, once home to a dozen plum trees, now a tangle of wild undergrowth and iron roots. But it wasn't the orchard that drew gasps when Tamsin confided in her friend Mrs. Aldwych. It was the peculiar detail that Eleanor always stopped by the last tree, knelt there, and stayed motionless for precisely 7 minutes, as though keeping a tryst with something buried. Then came the thunderstorm, a savage cracking affair that toppled trees and loosened old bones, and with it a discovery. The next morning, a young groundskeeper found a sodden journal near the orchard's edge, half concealed beneath broken stonework. Inside, sketches of a child's face repeatedly crossed out, a recipe for a sedative tincture, and a single sentence on the last page written in trembling ink. She must never remember what she saw beneath the nursery floor. The journal was handed, nervously, to Miss Ellery, who took it straight to her cousin, Henrietta Vale, the village's unofficial archivist and woman of formidable memory. Henrietta read the final line aloud twice, then reached for her coat. "Something was meant to stay forgotten," she whispered, "and now it's begun to remember itself." That evening, Eleanor was seen pacing at the post office steps, her expression pale and clenched as though struggling to contain something heavier than fear. She didn't speak, not even when handed a letter sealed in red wax that no one admitted to delivering. By nightfall the orchard was off limits, cordoned with string and marked with hanging bells, an old pre-Christian warding tradition not practiced in Eldergate for 50 years. But Eleanor returned anyway. She stood in the clearing, barefoot and trembling, and pressed her palm to the trunk of the last tree. The wind stopped, the bells ceased to chime, and in that dreadful silence something ancient, buried in both soil and memory, stirred awake. In the forgotten hamlet of Elmswood Hollow, a village so cloaked in fog and superstition that it seemed suspended in time, stood the crumbling silhouette of Wetherby House, its gabled roof sagging under years of silence and secrets too old for whispers. Ivy wrapped itself like strangling fingers around rusted balconies, while the iron gates groaned with the fatigue of decades untouched. No one had lived there for over 30 years, and those who remembered the Stroud family did so with the kind of unease reserved for ghost stories told too close to dusk. Then one April morning, under skies swollen with stormlight, a carriage as black as regret creaked its way up the weed-choked path, delivering a woman who seemed more shadow than flesh. Eliza Stroud, tall, thin, with eyes that had clearly seen more than they ever spoke, stepped down in silence, her presence as sudden and unsettling as a gust in a locked room. Her name, though unfamiliar to the young, sent a chill through the old, for it dredged up rumors long buried under fear of a child who vanished in the nursery fire of 1912, of a ledger rumored to list not just debts but betrayals, and of a will rewritten hastily days before a second, quieter death. Eliza said little at the inn, only that she had family matters to tend to at the old house, an innocuous phrase that in Elmswood Hollow could just as easily mean murder as marriage. But it was not her words that stirred suspicion, it was her timing. Just days before her arrival, the village church's archives were disturbed by a tremor of fate. A letter, yellowed and barely legible, had surfaced in a mislabeled box. It spoke cryptically of something hidden beneath the bones of the house, a place where no one dared tread since the fire, and it ended with a warning: do not return what was taken. Miss Isabel Whitmore, the quiet spinster who served as the village's unofficial chronicler, and its only genuine observer, felt the shift immediately. She watched Eliza with the kind of gaze that doesn't just see but listens. She noted how Eliza never asked about the villagers, but studied the graveyard with the precision of a cartographer, how she stood for hours in the rain beneath the old yew tree, where Edwin Stroud's memorial stone leaned slightly askew, as if recoiling from the earth itself. Then came the key, left deliberately at the iron gate of Weatherby House, old brass and cold to the touch, not lost but placed, as if passed from hand to hand across generations too frightened to speak. That night, for the first time in 33 years, a flicker of light danced behind the nursery window, a room long believed to have been sealed since the night screams were swallowed by fire, and the truth was said to have turned to ash. The villagers, many of whom had long taught their children to avoid the house without ever explaining why, began to speak again in hushed tones of the watcher child, of strange lullabies, heard in the wind, and of a mother who never wept aloud. But Miss Whitmore knew that legends don't resurface without reason. Secrets buried in silence don't sleep. They ferment, they curdle, and eventually they demand release. And when Eliza was spotted at dawn, kneeling in the mud, clawing at the roots beneath the yew with fingers bloodied and bare, Miss Whitmore understood with chilling clarity that Eliza had not returned to claim her legacy. She had come to disinter it. Whatever had been hidden, denied, or denied existence was no longer content to remain entombed in the polite fictions of village memory. Something old, long silenced, had found its voice, and as the first bell of morning tolled across Elmswood Hollow, its sound warped by mist and morning, Miss Whitmore, teacup trembling just slightly in her hand, looked toward the house and whispered into the silence. The past doesn't knock, it breaks the lock. In the heart of the parched countryside, tucked away in the forgotten reaches of Punjab, stood the ancestral Darbar Haveli, a crumbling monument to pride, legacy, and secrets buried beneath layers of dust and silence. The villagers rarely ventured near it after sunset. They spoke in whispers of its haunting stillness, of the way the wind seemed to lose its voice when it passed through its gates. But all those murmurs turned to cold dread when news broke that Amir Singh, the solitary, withdrawn nephew once entrusted with the estate's legal affairs, was found dead in his private study. The discovery was made by the old caretaker, a man hardened by age, but shaken to the bone, when his master did not ring for morning tea, something he had never failed to do in decades. The room was bolted from the inside, the windows rusted shut, untouched by time or trespass. A worn revolver lay loosely in Amir's right hand, and beside it, on the polished teak desk, was a single piece of paper, creased at the folds yet placed with uncanny care. There were no salutations, no farewells, only a stark line etched in trembling ink: I cannot bear the guava trees lie. The police deemed it an open and shut case, a troubled recluse, burdened by unseen woes, taking his own life in silence. The constable, efficient and eager to be done, declared it a suicide, after a cursory glance, and a quick word with the local coroner. But to Rowiya Appa, the village's quiet yet piercing observer of human nature, the neatness of the affair was its first red flag. She had seen enough of life to know that truth seldom walked hand in hand with convenience. Amir's death wasn't just sudden, it reverberated through the village like a low, mournful drumbeat that refused to fade. The message he left behind, the mention of the guava tree, plunged everyone into deeper speculation. Was it symbolic, a poetic lament, or worse, a literal pointer towards something festering beneath roots and memories? When the deceased's only known relative, Hina Bai, arrived from the city to settle affairs, her first question wasn't how he had died, it was when. A subtle inquiry, easily dismissed by most, but not by Rowiya Appa, for whom the timing of events often revealed far more than the events themselves. That night, beneath a thick silence, as moths flickered against yellowing bulbs, and the air hung heavy with the scent of old soil and unseen grief, the Haveli seemed more alive than ever. Rowia Appa sat with the vicar, an aging man who had once been a close confidant to Amir. He confessed in a low murmur that Amir had spoken, almost in passing, of a truth too heavy for the daylight to bear. At the time it had sounded like the ramblings of a melancholic bachelor. Now it rang like the toll of a distant bell, echoing through the corridors of the mind. A few days later, under the pretense of helping with the estate's paperwork, Rowia Appa visited the study, where Amir had taken his final breath. The solicitor, overwhelmed and unfamiliar with the household's intricate history, was grateful for her assistance. The room was a mirror of Amir's soul, precise, austere, untouched by warmth. Files were stacked like tombstones, correspondence was tied with meticulous care. Yet amidst this rigid order, something felt wrong. The family photo albums, those fading chronicles of bloodlines and bygone smiles, were lined up on the bookshelf, but one was missing. Volumes 1 through 5 sat intact, followed by Volume 7. Volume 6 had vanished. An oversight to some, but to Rowia Appa, who once solved an inheritance dispute based solely on the misplacement of embroidery spools, it was a siren. She pulled Volume 5 and examined its contents. Each photograph had been labeled with fastidious attention, names, dates and places neatly penned. But one photo stood out, a woman seated beneath a guava tree, a small child in her lap. The woman resembled the late Mrs. Darby, and the child, though turned slightly, bore an uncanny resemblance to a younger Hina Bai. Yet there was no caption, no note, no trace of identification. The page was eerily blank, as if someone had intended to erase it, not just from the album, but from memory itself. And suddenly, the pieces began to shift in Rowia Appa's mind. Amir hadn't died because of depression or loneliness, he had died protecting a truth. A truth that lived in the orchard, beneath the guava tree, where stories had been buried like seeds never meant to sprout. Perhaps the child in the photo was not merely a niece. Perhaps the missing album held more than just family memories. Perhaps it held answers that could fracture the very foundations of lineage and legacy. Amir had spent a lifetime safeguarding this silence, and when the weight of it became too much, he chose to fall rather than speak. But secrets, like roots, always find a way to rise. Rowia Appa knew then that this was not the end of a mystery. It was the beginning of one. The guava tree stood still outside, its leaves rustling softly, as though whispering truths only the dead could hear, and now perhaps, the living could finally begin to listen. Fenurch's true role in the Merton household had always been shrouded in ambiguity, more than just a steward, more than a mere keeper of the estate's legal matters. He had been its silent guardian, its quiet confidant, and most unsettlingly, its repository of secrets. His passing was met with the expected solemnity, of course, but there was a curious absence of grief, something almost too swift in its acceptance, as though his death had unwittingly loosened a knot that had been painfully tight for far too long. The dead, after all, cannot speak, but their silences, their omissions, Miss Marple knew, often spoke louder than words. And as she sat quietly in her drawing room, knitting her thoughts together like threads, she made a mental note to inquire not only about the missing family album, but also about the orchard. Some truths, once buried beneath the ground like seeds, do not stay at rest for long. The days following Harold Merton's funeral were thick with practicality, but strangely light on reverence. Harold's affairs, while considerable, had been meticulously organized in life, and death only served to underscore his efficiency. His house was set to be sold, his belongings would be split among distant cousins, and his obituary, though brief, was penned with nothing more than polite regret. And yet, for all the neatness and finality of it all, something hung in the air like a stubborn mist, refusing to clear. It was then, during an ordinary morning in the post office, that Miss Finch, the retired schoolteacher, casually remarked that she had often wondered what had become of Edith Grace. Her voice, as always, was soft and unassuming, but the words she spoke were far from insignificant. "Strange girl," she said with an absent air, "never quite right after the orchard." The words hung in the air, unnoticed by most but not by Miss Marple, whose keen ear caught the hidden weight behind them. Edith Grace, the name, forgotten for decades, had suddenly resurfaced, not tied to Harold or his late wife, but to the orchard again. Miss Marple's curiosity, piqued, led her to pursue this trail, with her usual meticulous care. A quiet inquiry here, a discreet question there, until in the midst of seemingly mundane paperwork, she found something that froze her thoughts. A school report card, dated 1933, for an Edith Grace. It was a document so innocuous in its appearance, yet so damning in its implications. The card, from a girls' academy in Sussex, detailed the girls' performance in subjects like arithmetic and composition, yet the most striking detail was the age, 14, at which her academic record abruptly ceased. No certificate of departure, no note of transfer, just an eerie silence, as if the girl's life had simply stopped without explanation. As Miss Marple turned the card over, a faint pencil mark caught her eye, a hastily erased address, but under the right light, one word was clear. Orchard Gate. It was more than just a coincidence. It was a message, a thread woven so thin it could easily be overlooked, but one that Miss Marple, with her lifelong understanding of the human heart, knew to follow. She had long held the belief that what people chose to hide spoke far more about them than what they willingly displayed, and now, all the hidden pieces of this intricate puzzle were beginning to fall into place. An orphaned girl, a mysterious disappearance, a missing school report card, and the orchard that seemed to hold all the answers, these were the threads that bound this strange story together. Yet, as Miss Marple delved deeper, she could not shake the nagging thought of Clara Fenwick. Was she merely a pawn in this intricate game, or was she the very key to unlocking the secrets that had long been buried beneath the soil of the Merton estate? Miss Marple knew that secrets didn't vanish by accident, they were erased intentionally, hidden with purpose. The more she uncovered, the more the pieces seemed to fit together, but there was one thing she had yet to solve: the connection between Edith Grace and the orchard. She knew that no child, especially one from a respectable girls' school, simply disappeared without reason, and the mention of Orchard Gate, found faintly on the card, was too significant to ignore. Further inquiries led her to the faded archives of the school in Sussex, where the former headmistress, now an elderly woman, recalled a quiet child named Edith. "A strange girl," she remarked with distant recollection, "left us suddenly, no explanation, no goodbyes. I believe something about a family illness, though I'm not sure," but Miss Marple, ever the skeptic, wasn't satisfied. The word illness seemed far too vague for a child to simply vanish without a trace. More searching among parish records, hospital admissions, and burial certificates yielded no answers. There was no Edith Grace buried anywhere in the county, no record of a marriage, no trace of her existence after that brief stint at the academy. It was as if Edith Grace had never truly lived at all, yet in the empty spaces, the whispers between the lines, Miss Marple felt the pulse of something more sinister at work. And with each passing day, as she pieced the fragments together, she grew more certain the truth was buried under the very roots of the orchard. And there, among the secrets of the Merton family, it waited, patiently to be uncovered. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled like a fog of quiet revelations as she considered the faint traces of a forgotten past, an era so deliberately buried that even the faintest mention of it seemed to provoke an uncomfortable shudder in those who dared remember. Edith Grace, a name once whispered only behind closed doors, now reappeared like an old photograph found at the bottom of a forgotten drawer, its edges worn and its story unclear, but still hauntingly familiar. The orchard, an innocent symbol of nature's beauty, had now become the backdrop to a mystery that lingered with a sinister weight, its secrets intertwined with a young girl's disappearance. Edith Grace had not simply faded from memory, she had been erased with careful precision, her existence rendered as inconsequential as the dust that settled on the corners of the Merton household. The school report card from 1933 found buried among old papers mocked Miss Marple's efforts. The neatly scribbled notes on her studies, the promise of a future interrupted, were dwarfed by the unsettling blankness of her sudden exit. No record of her leaving, no transfer, no final farewell, just a quiet, unnerving absence. The only clue, barely perceptible on the card's reverse side, was the faint remnants of an address, Orchard Gate. What had she known? Why had someone gone to such lengths to ensure that Edith Grace's life was scrubbed from the records, her history hidden beneath layers of silence? As Miss Marple traced this mystery through the memories of the village, she uncovered a trail of half-remembered faces and vague recollections. There had been something about Edith that unsettled those who had known her, a quiet girl with eyes that seemed too wise for her years, a girl who often wandered alone, drawn to the orchard, as if some force beyond her control had beckoned her there. The head mistress at Edith's school, now elderly and fragile, offered only a handful of uncertain words, memories clouded by time. Oh yes, I recall her, a quiet child, pale with hair the color of straw left in the rain. Never one to draw attention. She left though, after an illness I believe. Or maybe, perhaps she just stopped coming. Miss Marple's mind, however, refused to let go of the details that didn't add up. A girl like Edith, quiet, withdrawn, didn't simply vanish without a trace. The absence of any formal record, the subtle erasure of her name from every significant register, was no accident. It was intentional, and it was becoming more apparent that Edith's life and death were bound to the Merton family in ways that were meant to remain hidden. Clara Fenwick, too, began to weigh heavily on Miss Marple's thoughts. Clara's elusive nature, her unsettling response to the sugar bowl, her uneasy demeanor, all of it pointed to something buried deep within her, something that had long been left untouched until now. Could Clara, in some twisted way, be connected to Edith Grace? Had the two shared a bond so intense, so dark, that it had to be severed completely to maintain the fragile facade of respectability Mrs. Merton had so carefully cultivated? Miss Marple's inquiries led her down a winding path, one that veered from quiet conversations in the village shop to the intimate corners of Merton Lodge itself. Mrs. Maplethorpe, who had once worked for the Mertons, recalled the girl with a distracted air, as if the memory was a distant echo. Oh yes, I remember her now, a pale thing, always alone, often in the orchard, but no one knew where she came from, not really. Some said she was the child of a cousin fallen on hard times, others thought she was a ward of someone's friend, taken in out of charity. No one ever saw her parents though, and her last name, I can't recall that at all. Yet, amid the murk of uncertainty, there was one thing that seemed consistent: the striking solemn eyes of Edith Grace. Eyes that, when Miss Marple looked closely at Clara, seemed too familiar. The resemblance was undeniable, the same dark, watchful gaze, the same silence that spoke louder than words. Had Edith grown up, perhaps, into the woman who was now Clara Fenwick? Was Clara carrying the weight of a secret she herself barely understood, a secret she had inherited through blood or circumstance? As Miss Marple pondered these possibilities, she recalled Clara's reaction to the sugar bowl, a subtle tension that lingered long after the moment had passed. It wasn't just an object, not just a family heirloom, it was a key, a symbol of something long buried, something that had never been meant to resurface. The truth, however, was elusive. Like a shadow, it danced just beyond her reach, always slipping away as soon as she thought she had a firm hold on it. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to rely on what people said. The village, with its well-worn routines and careful silences, spoke only in half-truths, careful not to disturb the delicate fabric of propriety that held everything together. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that truth had a way of revealing itself, even in the most unlikely of places. And it was in that moment, as she stood in the parlor of Merton Lodge, pretending to return borrowed linens, that she saw it. Clara's composure was slipping, her outward politeness becoming more brittle with every passing moment. What had once been a serene, welcoming demeanor was now replaced by something harder, more strained. Miss Marple's eyes flicked over the familiar portraits on the walls, their painted smiles frozen in time. The picture of the Merton family, carefully curated to present an image of unity and grace, now seemed to mock her. The truth was hiding in plain sight, in every glance, in every gesture. Clara's nervousness, her avoidance of the most innocent of questions, each subtle shift in her behavior was another crack in the veneer. It was no longer a matter of finding answers. Miss Marple had long since known that the truth was within her grasp. It was now a matter of waiting for it to fall into her lap, like a fruit ripe for the picking. When it did, it would shake the very foundation of everything the Mertons had worked so hard to keep hidden. Miss Marple's intuition, always subtle and sharp, had guided her for years through the hidden currents of human nature. On this particular afternoon, she found herself wandering the dimly lit parlor of the Merton estate, her gaze once again falling on the portraits that lined the walls in their neat and deliberate arrangement. The austere faces of the Merton family stared back at her, men with hard, stern jawlines and women with regal, unwavering poise, each one more imposing than the last. They seemed to gaze down from their frames, judging the present with a silence that stretched across generations. But then, her eyes drifted to a singular portrait, one that didn't quite belong. Unlike the others, this painting didn't exude strength or dignity. The woman, in her late 30s, sat with a child at her feet, her expression distant, almost blurred, as if she were being slowly erased by time. But it wasn't the woman that drew Miss Marple's attention, it was the child. Something about the child's eyes was wrong. There was a vividness to them, a sharpness that seemed to pierce through the canvas, a gaze that didn't quite belong in the world of faded elegance that surrounded it. As Clara excused herself to fetch the borrowed linens, Miss Marple felt a pull, a quiet urgency to study the painting further. There, under the soft light of the parlor, she leaned in closer, her sharp eyes narrowing as she examined the details. It was subtle, but undeniable, the gleam across the surface of the portrait. Something had been changed. The child's eyes, they weren't painted the same way as the rest of the piece. The brushstrokes were newer, more delicate, and the layering was uneven, as if someone had deliberately altered the child's gaze. Why? The question lingered in her mind like a whisper she couldn't quite catch. Miss Marple's fingers itched to touch the painting, but she resisted. Whoever had repainted those eyes had done so with a specific intent, perhaps to erase a link, a connection between the past and the present.
But to whom?
The mother, the child, or someone else entirely. Clara returned, her footsteps light but somehow hesitant, as if the air itself had thickened around her. Miss Marple casually remarked on the painting's unusual composition, her voice steady but layered with a quiet depth. Clara's reaction was swift and telling. Her eyes flicked to the portrait, and she turned away almost immediately, her face drawn in discomfort. "I never liked it," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "There's something about it, something that doesn't belong." The words, though soft, carried an undeniable weight. Miss Marple's eyes softened, understanding the unspoken truth. Sometimes it is the things that do not belong that reveal the most hidden of secrets. As Miss Marple left the room, the portrait stayed with her, the haunting image of the mother and child lingering in her mind, the altered eyes, the silence of the painting, the threads of the past that seemed to tug at her consciousness. She was certain of one thing: there was more to this painting than met the eye, and she would find it, no matter where it led. The very next morning, a letter arrived at the vicarage. It was unsigned, the handwriting uneven, almost desperate in its urgency. It contained a single cryptic sentence: "You were right to look in the sugar bowl, but be careful. The truth kills." The words seemed to hang in the air, their meaning clear enough yet shrouded in ominous warning. Miss Marple read it twice, her brow furrowing with thought. She didn't believe in melodrama, nor did she place much stock in anonymous threats. But this letter was different. The quiet urgency in its tone spoke to something deeper, something buried beneath layers of time and secrecy. The truth, it seemed, had claws, and it was not about to release its grip so easily. It was then that Miss Marple's pace quickened. The quiet unfolding of events she had been allowing to develop on their own had shifted. She had no more time to wait, it was time to act. Under the guise of inspecting the estate's grounds for the parish fete, Miss Marple made her way to the farthest corner of the Merton orchard. The trees there were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like bony fingers in the dimming light. It was a place that always felt different, as though it held secrets that even the earth itself had tried to forget. There, beyond the third row of apple trees, she remembered that the ground had once been disturbed, as if something had been buried, and then quickly forgotten. But Miss Marple was not one to let things stay forgotten. She called upon Mr. Briggs, the retired railway porter turned gardener, who had helped her on more than one occasion in the past. He owed her a few favors, ones that had come in the form of quiet legal advice and discreet assistance with her botanical endeavors. She gave him no explanation, only a location, and he understood without further question. The soil gave way with surprising ease, crumbling beneath the spade, as if it had been waiting for someone to come along and stir it up. It wasn't long before the blade struck something solid, not stone, but something wrapped in oilcloth, stiffened by time and damp. Miss Marple's hands, though trembling ever so slightly, moved with deliberate calm as she unwrapped the bundle. Inside, she found 3 objects: a torn piece of muslin cloth, stained dark at one corner with something that looked almost like blood, a child's sandal, cracked and brittle with age, and a tarnished locket, its surface still gleaming faintly in the weak sunlight. The sight of them sent a chill through her. Each item seemed to carry the weight of a story, one that had been abandoned long ago, but was now forcing its way back to the surface. The sandal, so small and fragile, spoke of a life interrupted, perhaps taken too soon. The muslin cloth, stained and frayed, whispered of a tragedy long buried, and the locket, its tarnish almost beautiful in its age, seemed to call out, as if it held the key to something that had been deliberately hidden. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her breath slow and measured as she stared at the objects before her. There was a heaviness to the air now, an unspoken truth that had begun to stir, reluctant but insistent. She knew the truth was close, but it was also dangerous, too dangerous to be left alone for much longer. The slow rising tide of something buried for far too long was about to surface, and Miss Marple, as always, would be there to meet it head-on. Miss Marple's fingers trembled as she held the locket, its weight betraying something far deeper than mere metal. There was history in its delicate tarnished surface, a burden of memories locked away for decades. It had been buried, hidden as though its very existence could bring everything to the surface, and yet, Miss Marple knew, even after all this time, the contents of this locket were far from forgotten. They were suspended in guilt, the kind that refuses to fade, lingering in the corners of minds long after the event itself had been buried. The locket, as she opened it, revealed 2 photographs, one of Mrs. Merton, young and composed, wearing an iris-shaped brooch, long believed lost during the war, her expression cool, distant as if she were posing not for affection, but obligation. And beside it, on the opposite side, was the image of a child, no more than a year old, with a round face and solemn eyes. There was something chillingly wrong with this child's expression, too still, too serious for its age. It wasn't Edith Grace, of that she was certain. The hair was a lighter shade, the eyes lacked the penetrating depth she had seen in the repainted portrait, yet there was an undeniable echo of someone in the sharpness of its brow, the curve of its mouth, the depth of its cheekbones. Who this child was, Miss Marple could not say, but it was clear that the child had meant something deep and significant to Mrs. Merton. After all, no one hides something so intimate unless there's a weighty reason to do so, a reason that had been buried along with it. As she sat there beneath the quiet shade of the tree, the locket now resting gently in her palm, she reflected on the nature of memory, how it distorts, how it protects, and how it erases. Sometimes, memories are not lost to time, but to the force of will, sealed away under layers of guilt. The child in the photograph hadn't been forgotten, it had been deliberately hidden, and the piece of torn muslin cloth, embroidered with delicate threads, but now shredded at the hem, seemed to whisper of a time long past, one steeped in sorrow. The bloodstain on the fabric was no accident, Miss Marple knew. The dark stain had once been fresh, had once held its own story, one of hurried actions, and an untold tragedy. Something had happened, something that had not been an accident but an event, a tragedy tied not to carelessness, but to fear, to silence, to the need for concealment. Miss Marple remembered a moment from the early days of Mrs. Merton's reclusive period. At a ladies' garden tea, Mrs. Merton had spoken briefly of a season of sorrow that had followed her withdrawal from society. No one had pressed her for more details, dismissing it as a vague reflection on the past. But Miss Marple now understood that this sorrow wasn't just a vague sense of melancholy. It was tied to something far darker. The orchard, the sugar bowl, the repainted eyes of the portrait, all of these threads pointed to more than a mere loss. They pointed to a deliberate erasure, a disappearance of something or someone that had been central to the story, yet had never been acknowledged. The child, unnamed, unspoken, had been hidden in the records, erased from memory, and Miss Marple knew that it was time to uncover the truth. She made her decision. It was time to speak with Clara Fenwick once more, not to accuse, but to understand. 2 days later, Clara arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. She looked drawn, weary in a way that no rest could remedy, as if the very weight of something unsaid had taken its toll on her. Her eyes carried the shadow of sleepless nights, her posture stiff and brittle, her once composed demeanor now crumbling under an unseen pressure. She handed Miss Marple a letter, unsigned, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. It contained only a photograph, Mrs. Merton holding the same child from the locket, now revealed for all to see, and a cryptic line beneath. "Is this where you began?" Clara hesitated before speaking, her voice fragile. She told Miss Marple of her own past, of a mother, Estelle Fenwick, who had never spoken of her father, and of the secrecy that had hung over her life like a heavy fog. Clara had been only 16 when Estelle died, but even before then there had always been the sense of a lie buried beneath the stories her mother told. There had been no photographs from Clara's early years, just one faint, carefully staged image from when she was about 3, its authenticity questionable, as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase the real history of her childhood. Clara spoke, her voice faltering, of her mother's weeping after a bout of fever, murmuring something about the orchard and a child named Edith. But Clara had never dared to ask more. Miss Marple listened intently, her gaze unwavering, her hands gentle as they rested on her lap. She knew this wasn't just about the secrets of Clara's past, it was about something far deeper, something that had been hidden and buried, carefully erased by those who feared the truth. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and though the truth seemed to beckon, it was clear that uncovering it would reveal far more than anyone was prepared to confront. Miss Marple's mind raced, but her expression remained calm, unreadable. She had known for some time that this was no simple mystery. This was something far more insidious, a story of guilt, shame, and the lengths people go to in order to bury the truth, and she was determined to see it to its end, no matter the cost. Clara stood still, the weight of the locket heavy in her hand, a delicate artifact whose true meaning was yet to fully reveal itself. She had known somewhere deep within that the truth of her life had always been held in shadows, woven together by secrets long buried. Now, with the locket in her grasp, the past unfurled before her like a forgotten manuscript, its pages brittle and torn, but still legible. The mystery of Edith Grace, never quite a shadow but always something more, began to take shape in the quiet moments between breaths, as the connection between Clara and the child in the photograph became undeniable. She was not the child in the locket, no, but she could feel the echoes of a life that had been severed from the world, a life marked by abandonment, secrecy and fear. Edith's child, the one erased from records, the one who had been pushed aside in favor of silence, had not been forgotten, just carefully concealed. The orchard where that child had once played, had now become a tomb, but not for long. Miss Marple, her keen eyes always watching, had connected the dots that no one else had dared to. The sugar bowl, the odd note left behind, the unmarked graves in the orchard, all were threads in a tapestry of deceit woven by those who feared the truth more than they feared the lies. But as Clara's fingers trembled around the locket, something shifted, something ancient and buried deep inside her began to stir. The name Edith Grace lingered in the air, and with it, the horrifying realization that her own mother, Estelle, had not been merely evasive about the past, she had lied to protect them both from a truth far darker than Clara could have imagined. The child in the photograph, the one who had never been spoken of aloud, had been lost not in time, but in shame. Miss Marple's voice, as steady as ever, seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories as she spoke of the orchard burial, of the secrets hidden in plain sight. Clara's heart ached as she felt the pull of those long-forgotten names, those faces that had been concealed by layers of guilt. The truth had always been waiting, patient, unyielding, and now, as the room seemed to hold its breath, it was ready to break free. Miss Marple, in her quiet, unassuming way, had already laid the groundwork. She had known long before Clara did, that the truth would not be a comfort but a reckoning. No one in the room spoke, the air was thick with the weight of history, the weight of something long denied, and Clara knew then that her life, too, had been part of a design she hadn't yet understood. Her mother's silence, her own lost memories, and the strange unsettling photograph, it all pointed to a life rewritten, not by chance, but by deliberate erasure. This wasn't just about a locket, or even a child, it was about the sins that had been buried in silence, the lives that had been altered by fear, and the quiet unraveling of a scandal that had once been thought safe from exposure. Miss Marple, always patient, always composed, had led them all here, where the past no longer remained locked away. The weight of the truth was now impossible to deny, and as Clara clutched the locket tightly in her hand, she knew that whatever secrets it held, they would be revealed, not with violence or anger, but with the steady unrelenting force of justice. Clara stood motionless, her hands trembling as she clutched the locket, the weight of its meaning pressing heavily on her chest. The truth that had been slowly unraveling over the past hours now seemed to come crashing down with brutal finality. What she had always thought was her life, a life of quiet obscurity, of being a forgotten ward of distant relatives, was in fact a carefully constructed lie, a narrative woven from secrets and betrayals that reached deep into the past. Each word Miss Marple spoke seemed to peel back the layers of deception, revealing the haunting truth that Clara had never imagined. She wasn't merely an orphan, or an accidental relative, she was the granddaughter of Mrs. Merton, the product of a forbidden liaison between Edith, Miss Merton's daughter, and a man whose name had once been whispered in society's upper echelons, but had been long buried in scandal. The realization that she was the granddaughter of a woman whose existence had been systematically erased from the records shook Clara to her core. Edith, once a child full of life and questions, had been silenced and hidden away, her birth a source of shame so deep that Mrs. Merton had chosen to bury it entirely. The child, born out of a love that society could not accept, was raised in the shadows, under a borrowed name, trained to be invisible, to never ask questions, to live a life that was merely an echo of what it could have been. Edith had been quiet, obedient to the bitter end, until the whispers of the truth finally reached her. Miss Marple's voice was soft but unwavering as she recounted Edith's final days, days spent in a prison of her own making, locked away in a life that had no room for rebellion, no space for the anger and questions that were slowly building inside her. It was the worst kind of prison, the prison of silence, of invisible shackles. But even in this prison, Edith had found the courage to question, to seek answers, and in doing so, she had uncovered part of the truth, a truth that had been too dangerous to bear. Mrs. Merton had known, of course. She had always known that Edith was beginning to uncover the family's darkest secrets, and for her, that was the greatest threat of all. A woman whose position was built on the facade of respectability and social standing could not afford to have a scandal, especially one tied to her own flesh and blood, exposed. So, the decision had been made. Edith was not only erased from society's eyes, she was erased from history itself. Her child, the one that could have carried her legacy forward, was sent away, hidden under a false name, to live a life that had never truly been hers. Clara, as Miss Marple revealed, had unknowingly carried that legacy all along. The granddaughter of Edith, she was the heir to a truth that had been buried long ago, but now, with each passing moment, it was rising to the surface. The walls of deception were beginning to crumble. Miss Marple spoke of Harold Fenchurch with a quiet authority. He had been the custodian of Mrs. Merton's secrets, the man who had ensured that the truth would never be known. He had erased Edith's name from every record, destroyed the family's albums, and carefully crafted the story that Edith had gone abroad and never returned. The orchard, where the echoes of the past had been buried, had been left undisturbed for years until now. Harold's role in all of this had been more than that of a mere facilitator of lies. He had been the architect of the great cover-up. His actions had been born not out of cruelty, but out of a misguided sense of protection. A desire to protect Mrs. Merton, to protect the Merton name, and perhaps, in some quiet recess of his conscience, to protect Clara herself. Yet, as Miss Marple so calmly noted, even the most meticulous of lies cannot remain hidden forever. The truth had a way of seeping through the cracks, no matter how tightly they were sealed. Harold's decision to take his own life was not an act of cowardice, but the collapse of a man who could no longer bear the weight of his own omissions. He had lived for years with the crushing guilt of erasing a child, of destroying the legacy of someone who had never had the chance to fight back. Clara's resemblance to the vanished child had been the final crack in the carefully constructed facade. It had reawakened a past that Harold could no longer ignore, a past that had haunted him in the quietest moments of his life. The orchard, once a place of peace, had become a tomb for the secrets that had been buried there. And the sugar bowl, the last of Mrs. Merton's keepsakes, had been the final testament to the weight of those secrets. Miss Marple's voice dropped lower, her words barely a whisper as she spoke of the sugar bowl's contents, the note that had been placed there not as a confession, but as a cry for help. Harold had left it there, not to incriminate himself, but to ensure that if the truth ever found its way to the light, someone would know what had really happened. The note, vague yet unmistakable, had been a lifeline, a sign for someone like Clara to one day uncover the past. And now, as Clara stood there, the locket still in her hand, her mind racing to make sense of everything that had been revealed, Miss Marple spoke the final, quiet truth. It had not been murder for the sake of malice, she said, but the necessity of maintaining a lie that had grown too large, too monstrous to continue. But as the truth slowly unfurled, Miss Marple's eyes glinted with something more, a knowing look that suggested there was still more to come. Harold had not acted alone. There had been another presence, another hand in this dark story, and Miss Marple, ever the perceptive observer, knew that the final piece of the puzzle was yet to be uncovered. The truth, long buried, was now on the verge of coming to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. The room, heavy with the weight of these revelations, held its breath, knowing that this was only the beginning of a far deeper mystery yet to be solved. Miss Marple's gaze, having remained locked in the shadows for so long, now shifted with subtle precision to Mr. Pettigrew. His composure, so perfectly crafted, faltered just slightly, an almost imperceptible adjustment of posture, a twitch of his cuff, but in that small quiet shift, Miss Marple saw everything. Her voice, cool and collected, began not with accusation, but with delicate observation. She spoke of Mr. Pettigrew, the cousin of Mrs. Bantry, and a man often found in the company of the Merton. Once upon a time, he had courted Mrs. Merton, though their relationship ended in an unspoken rupture, leaving behind no scandal, only a whisper of something that had vanished into the night. Few recalled or chose to speak of it, but Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, reminded them of the time when Mrs. Merton disappeared for several months after the end of their brief courtship, returning quieter, colder, more distant. It was during this time that Mr. Pettigrew's investments began to grow, subtly, and almost imperceptibly, into a stake in the very company managing the Merton estate. His wealth, while rising, remained hidden beneath the surface, and his influence, while strong, was woven so subtly into the fabric of the family's dealings that few noticed it. It was only when Miss Marple spoke of Harold Fenech, the meticulous guardian of the Merton estate's records, that the layers of deception began to peel back. Fenech, known for his exactness, had never acted impulsively, yet after Clara's arrival, he had been seen destroying papers, something entirely out of character for the man who kept even the most trivial receipts with care. Miss Marple's voice turned thoughtful, questioning why Harold would do such a thing. Her answer, however, was chilling. He had been threatened, not with the exposure of his secrets, but with the revelation of something far more dangerous, something that could unravel the carefully constructed lies surrounding Edith, Grace, and the hidden orchard. Mr. Pettigrew, Miss Marple explained with the calmness of someone revealing a terrible truth, had been quietly maneuvering to buy Merton Lodge after Clara's sale. His offers had been subtle, indirect, conveyed through third parties, but when Harold hesitated, Mr. Pettigrew had reminded him of what lay buried in the family's past, and what might happen if others began to dig. And then, the dark secret behind Harold's tragic end became clearer. The locked study, the note, the pistol, all were plausible, yes, but there was one detail no one had questioned. The ink on the note, it didn't match the pen on Harold's desk. No, it matched the ink of Mr. Pettigrew's own fountain pen, a rare violet hue imported from Belgium, a gift from his late sister. Mr. Pettigrew remained eerily silent, his face an unreadable mask, but in that silence, Miss Marple's sharp mind pieced the puzzle together. It wasn't murder in the traditional sense, she observed, but a psychological manipulation, a final push on a man who had already been teetering on the brink. It wasn't the weapon that had killed Harold, it was the suffocating knowledge that everything he had guarded, everything he had worked for was about to crumble, and that he would be the one to bear the blame. Miss Marple folded her hands with a quiet certainty, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Truth does not punish the wicked, it simply refuses to remain forgotten. The room fell into an oppressive silence, broken only by Clara's soft, tremulous voice, asking what had become of Edith. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the orchard as she spoke, her voice now softer, tinged with the weight of a truth that had yet to be fully uncovered. That, my dear, is the final piece of this tale, the one we must still uncover. And so, on a tranquil morning, filled with the gentle promise of late spring, Clara returned to the orchard, not to investigate further, but simply to walk, to breathe in the air that had once borne the weight of so many secrets. Miss Marple had asked to accompany her, and Clara, in her quiet grief, had agreed. They walked side by side, the silence between them, heavy, but not oppressive. The orchard, still brimming with the beauty of apple trees in bloom, seemed untouched by time. The undergrowth grew wild, and the soft hum of bees filled the air as they moved through the space. Clara's hands clasped behind her, her gaze lowered, but not in shame. No, Miss Marple noticed, there was no shame in Clara's step, only a deep absorbing quiet, as if she were coming to terms with something far greater than herself. It was as if, in that moment, she was not merely walking through the orchard but through the past itself, absorbing everything the land had held in its silence. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, watched Clara as she moved, sensing that there was still more, so much more beneath the surface. The orchard had given up its secrets, but its final revelation remained hidden in the quiet rustle of leaves, in the soft breath of wind that swept through the branches, as if urging the truth to rise one final time. The mystery was not over yet, not by a long shot. In the soft, quiet light of an early spring morning, Clara stood at the edge of the orchard, a place that had always felt like a secret suspended in time, its air thick with memories that seemed to whisper through the rustling leaves. As they approached the spot where the bundle had once been found, now covered by a young sapling, Clara's gaze lingered, searching for something she couldn't name. Without needing to ask, Miss Marple, as she often did, shared the truth that had been buried so long, slowly unwrapping the past like peeling layers of an old, worn letter. Edith Grace, she began softly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken years, was born into a world of hidden truths, raised in the shadows of silence. The pieces began to fit together for Clara, as Miss Marple spoke of the tragic confrontation between a mother who could no longer defend herself and a daughter who had found the courage to speak. It had not been a deliberate act, but a desperate flight from a life suffocated by secrets. On that rainy April afternoon, Edith, in a fit of panic, had fallen in the orchard, her head striking a branch slick with rain, the blow not fatal but enough to render her unconscious. In the deep, still silence of the trees, Mrs. Merton, in her shock and fear, had hidden her daughter's body, burying both her flesh and the consequences of her own inaction. Clara stood motionless, absorbing the truth with a quiet dignity that matched her grief, not a tear shed, but the weight of her mother's unspoken suffering settling heavily between them. After a long, still pause, Clara finally knelt at the base of the sapling, her fingers brushing the earth as though to touch the fragments of a story that had remained hidden for too long. She tried, Clara whispered, her voice breaking the silence, and Miss Marple, ever patient, simply placed a hand on her shoulder, comfort not in pity, but in shared understanding, an acknowledgement of the loss that had been too great for words. Back in the tranquility of St. Mary Me, Miss Marple resumed her simple routine in the garden, tending to her roses, each snip of the shears a small act of care, a reminder that everything requires attention, even the things most easily overlooked. It was a quiet reflection, the way she saw life, full of tangled branches and hidden thorns, yet also capable of growth when nurtured. As she trimmed a pale pink climber, she thought on the chain of events that had brought her to this moment, the sugar bowl, an innocuous object, yet the catalyst that had shattered the silence and released the truth. How curious, she mused, that something as fragile as a porcelain bowl could unravel so much, revealing the hidden layers of lives entwined by silence and guilt. The human heart, much like her roses, could be bound by expectations, pruned by years of restraint, but eventually, it would grow where it was meant to. And when pressed too hard, too long, it would either wither or burst free. Mrs. Merton, so poised, so controlled, had lived her life in the shadow of that unhealed wound, as had Harold Fenchurch, dutifully shielding others from truths he was never allowed to speak. As for Miss Pettigrew, driven not by malice, but by a desire to control what had once slipped through his grasp, he had thought himself above consequence. In the end, it was Clara, the one who had no say, the one who inherited not just the estate, but the weight of its hidden sins. Miss Marple did not pity her, for Clara, she knew, possessed a quiet strength, one that could endure the weight of years and the crushing silence of forgotten truths. The orchard, once a place of sorrow, would be transformed, perhaps into a space for laughter, for children, or a library where the past could be remembered, but not in the heavy, suffocating way it had once been. It would be a place for living, for breathing, for looking forward, though Miss Marple suspected that the ghosts of memory would linger like the scent of lilac after a spring rain, always just beneath the surface. As Clara and Miss Marple left the orchard behind, the tension that had gripped the land for so long began to ease, replaced by a sense of closure, though the air remained thick with the weight of things left unsaid, untended for too long. As Miss Marple bent down to adjust the rosebush, her cat wound itself around her skirts, purring softly in the morning air. She smiled faintly, her eyes scanning the garden before settling on the petals that had begun to fall in delicate spirals. "Love and guilt," she murmured under her breath, almost as if the words themselves were part of the garden's fabric. "They often grow on the same tree." It was a thought that lingered with her, but she said nothing more, returning to her work, trimming with steady, practiced hands as the soft green leaves fell around her like forgotten memories. The days that followed were a return to normalcy, though there was something in the air, a slight shift, an undercurrent, as though the rhythm of the village had subtly changed. The vicar's sermons resumed their gentle cadence, offering pious comfort through familiar metaphors, while the postmistress resumed her gossiping, though with less fervor, as if still carrying the weight of the past week's revelations. At Merton Lodge, the long shuttered windows were flung open to let in the warmth of the sun, and Clara Fenwick, after much contemplation, had chosen to remain. It wasn't an easy decision, the pull of London's anonymity, its distractions had beckoned her like a siren, tempting her to slip away from the painful lingering truth. Yet something within her had shifted, something Miss Marple had said once, almost casually: grief isn't something to escape, it's something to replant, like a root-bound plant that needs room to grow. Clara had remembered those words, and they had stayed with her, guiding her as she walked through the orchard, now free from the choking brambles. The once secretive space had transformed into something open, a small corner for laughter and new beginnings. The benches were set beneath the now healthy apple trees, and soon a wooden sign would be painted with the words, "Orchard Hollow," a place for reading, quiet reflection and storytelling. Clara had written to the parish council with a modest proposal for a community garden, open, inviting and inclusive, with a dedicated area for children's books. The council, after some initial hesitation, had agreed, swayed by Miss Marple's quiet endorsement and Mrs. Bantry's unyielding enthusiasm. Whispers of discontent still surfaced now and then. Some murmured it was improper to turn such a personal space into a public one, questioning whether Clara, with her modern views and uncertain lineage, truly understood the intricacies of village life. But with each passing week, those voices grew fainter, swallowed by the quiet dignity Clara radiated. She listened more than she spoke, always respectful, always restrained, her curiosity gentle but persistent. She had learned the art of saying no with grace, and yes with an open heart. Even the notoriously resistant grocers, who had once eyed her with suspicion, began to soften, offering the freshest apples from their orchard each Thursday. Miss Marple, observing all of this from her quiet corner, felt a warmth in her chest, not the pride of victory, nor the satisfaction of triumph, but something deeper, more intangible, a quiet recognition of healing. The past had not been erased, it never could be, but it had been acknowledged, unearthed like an old forgotten locket, and in that revelation, something had been restored. It wasn't the estate, nor the family name that had been reclaimed, but something far older, more enduring. Roots, after all, do not wither in darkness. They wait, patiently, until the light allows them to grow again. Clara, too, was learning to wait, not in the passive, resigned way of those who see time as their enemy, but with purpose, like the orchard itself, now brimming with life and promise. She stood at the edge of the garden, the weight of her mother's legacy, heavy in her chest, but not suffocating. And though the shadows of the past would always linger, there was a quiet understanding in her heart. She had a future now, a place to grow, just as the orchard had grown, from a secret into a sanctuary. With each passing day, Clara's voice grew steadier, and her resolve, like the budding blossoms in the orchard, strengthened with time. As spring gradually yielded to summer's warmth, the first parcels of children's books arrived, their crisp pages promising new stories and new beginnings. The orchard, once a place of sorrow and loss, now began to transform, slowly but surely, into a vibrant space of renewal. It seemed that some truths, like hidden seeds, wait beneath the surface, tucked away in quiet corners of the heart, buried beneath layers of grief and silence, only to rise when the moment is right. In this tale, there was no grand confrontation or dramatic revelation to crack the case open. Instead, it was the quiet, patient unraveling of time, a broken sugar bowl, and the discerning eye of Miss Marple that led to the truth's inevitable emergence. What began with a cryptic note, delicate and hesitant, slowly unraveled into a decades-old silence that had concealed the truth for far too long. The orchard, which had once been haunted by memories of pain and regret, began to bloom once more, its branches swaying with the whispers of something more hopeful, life, laughter, and the resilience of the human spirit. There is something profoundly moving in the idea that healing does not always come from punishment or retribution, but from the gentle, unwavering light of truth. Clara had not simply inherited a name, but a legacy, a voice that had been silenced for far too long. And in finding that voice, she chose not to repeat the past, but to replant it, giving it space to grow into something new, something that could stand in the light, rather than be buried in shadow. But it begs the question, what if the sugar bowl had never been broken? Would the truth have stayed locked away forever, hidden beneath the surface like a secret too dangerous to speak? Or do secrets, like roots, always find their way to the light eventually, regardless of the darkness that tries to hide them? The truth, it seems, has a way of creeping forward when the time is right, even when it is least expected. We'd love to know your thoughts. What moment in this tale resonated most with you? Did you see the signs earlier than Clara did, or was the secret as elusive as it appeared? Share your reflections with us in the comments below. Your insights are what make this community so special, and they help other mystery lovers find their way here. If you enjoyed this subtle, unfolding mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more stories in the Miss Marple style, elegant, psychological, and brimming with gentle suspense. And if you know someone who appreciates a good cozy twist, please share this story with them. It's a small gesture that helps us grow our circle of fellow mystery minds. Until next time, stay curious and keep your sugar bowls close, because you never know when the truth might come spilling out.